Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines. The US stocks have opened lower after earlier gains in European and Asian markets. This comes after shares jumped yesterday following Trump's tariff reversal. US President Donald Trump pauses tariffs on dozens of trading partners, instead imposing a blanket 10% import levy. Global stock markets rally following the announcement. Meanwhile, China has urged the US to meet halfway after Trump introduced a huge 125% retaliatory tariff on Chinese imports. The ASEAN nation has warned of a severe impact on global economic stability following the fresh US duties. In response to the recent tariff action, ASEAN trade ministers have met, announcing there will be no retaliatory measures on the United States. China have already said they are ready to work with ASEAN nations to enhance trade cooperation. More than 15 years after the deadly 26/11 Mumbai terror attacks, one of its key accused, Tawahar Hossain Rana, is extradited to India from the United States. The Pakistan-born Canadian national arrives in Delhi on a special flight. US and Russian delegates have arrived in Istanbul for a meeting on strengthening diplomatic ties. US officials have previously stated that the Russia-Ukraine war and security will not, however, be on the agenda. Reported overnight strikes in Ukraine have injured at least a dozen people as the British Defence Secretary is set to host defence ministers from 30 countries in Brussels today. US President Donald Trump says that military action in Iran is absolutely possible if the countries can't agree on a nuclear deal. The leader also says that Israel will play a leading role in negotiations and any action taken. US financial markets have been rattled by President Trump's aggressive trade measures, sparking days of steep volatility and investor unease. As today, US stocks opened low after earlier gains in the European and Asian markets. This happened as the EU put retaliatory tariffs against the US on hold after Donald Trump paused tariff hikes for 90 days. It all started on April the 2nd when markets plunged following the new tariffs targeting imports from China and other trade deficit nations. This followed through till the 4th of April when the Dow Jones dropped over 2,200 points, a 5.5% fall, among its worst point drops in history. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ also sank, with the NASDAQ slipping into bear market territory. Then on the 8th of April, the new reciprocal tariff system kicked in with 104% on Chinese imports and 20% on EU goods. Markets fell again as investors braced for countermeasures and global slowdown risks. Following on to the 9th, when confusion emerged, Trump confirmed a 90-day pause to tariffs for all countries apart from China. The move sparked modest relief when the Dow gained 400 points, though broader uncertainties lingered. And now coming to today, the 10th of April, when, despite US losses, global markets in Europe and Asia bounced. As the EU delayed retaliation, the euro surged while the US dollar dropped sharply after Trump paused tariff hikes, excluding China, causing further instability in currency markets. We are now joined by Ayanaba Banerjee, assistant producer for NewsX World, to give us the latest numbers. Ayanaba, what have you got for us?
Hello, Thomas. So the US markets are very volatile right now. Let's move on to the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is basically a stock market index which tracks 30 large publicly owned blue chip companies like Apple and Microsoft, we can see that it is currently down. It stands at 27.40 points. It is down by 2.45 points. It's down by 8.17 percentage. The numbers are constantly changing, but the market is down. That is what we can see currently on the screen. Now moving on to NASDAQ, which is a global electronic marketplace which is crucial for tech and growth stocks. We can again see this market is also down, this stock is also down. It currently stands at 16,627.19 points. The market is low. It has gone down by 499.13 points by 2.94%. This is the current state of US markets. Now moving on to S&P 500, which includes the 500 leading US publicly traded companies. This market is also highly volatile. It's also going down. It stands at 5,321.29 points. It has lost 132.73 points. It is down by 2.43%. This comes after Trump has paused all of the tariffs with exception to China. Let's see how the markets will be faring in future. Thank you, Thomas. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you very much, Ian Naba. We now move to Ross Feingold, political risk analyst, to discuss this further. Thank you very much, Ross, for joining us. Why have the American markets opened in the way that they have, given the contrast with the Asian and the European markets that we saw earlier today?
It looks like, at least for today, there's some measure of stability in the marketplace. People have already taken into account the rise in tariffs, the pausing of the tariffs, and they're looking for what kind of clear signals we will have about the future of international trade. Those signals are going to be unclear for quite a few weeks. I think people are waiting to see what countries will the United States and the Trump administration prioritize for bilateral negotiations and possibly bilateral deals. An important thing to keep in mind here is that the Trump administration has said that several dozen countries have contacted them to have bilateral negotiations, and the Trump administration is willing to do that, but they're going to have to prioritize. They can't talk to every country at the same time. So something I think worth paying attention to is which countries are on the priority list, and then we'll see after effects from that in the marketplace.
Ross, the stock markets are obviously all based around uncertainty and feelings. How do you think that the average American investor is feeling about the United States right now, in the way that Donald Trump has sort of flip-flapped around his decisions regarding these tariffs?
Certainly, retail investors are very nervous, especially people who have retirement accounts for the future, or current retirees who rely on mostly equity and to some extent fixed income holdings in their retirement accounts. So the retail investor, the average person, is certainly very worried about the volatility. They get very scared by large falls like we saw in preceding days. They're very happy about the recovery. Institutional investors, again, they're probably looking for the signals about which countries are going to be prioritized for bilateral negotiations, and then they'll make their market moves for either country-specific or sector-specific after the Trump administration sends more clear signals about which countries will get priority in bilateral negotiations.
In contrast to the 34% tariffs that were originally put on China, 8 days later we now see a 125% tariff put on China by the US, the only country now that doesn't have a 10% base levy. We unexpectedly, after this announcement, did see the Chinese markets still rise. What are your thoughts on that?
There's been a lot of government activity in the marketplace in China. They do have state-controlled funds that could enter the marketplace to be basically to be a backstop to bring an end to volatility and support the marketplace. And everybody knows that these activities are not a secret, and that's one of the things the Chinese government can do in times of uncertainty. But I think retail investors in China are certainly very nervous about the trajectory for U.S.-China trade, as would be institutional investors as well, to the extent that they're invested in domestic equities. it really remains to be seen if China could stimulate domestic consumer spending, which, all experts have been saying that if China wants to really put its economy on a firm footing and return to the era of higher, over 5% growth, they need to spur domestic spending. And the problem is Chinese people, they like to save rather than spend on new things like washing machines, and they're certainly not spending on real estate at the moment. So that certainly is a big issue for the Chinese market.
Ross, what do you think of the public negotiations between China and the US? Obviously, Donald Trump himself is the mouthpiece of these tariffs, putting them forward. He's using fruitful language, to put it lightly, to describe the countries that are coming up to him and wanting to make these deals, whereas China's Premier Xi Jinping has spoken mostly through his foreign ministers and spokespeople, but still using quite heated language. What do you think of these public appearances by the two biggest economies in the world, and how do you think the markets are going to react to those two?
It's certainly a very different approach. Trump takes to social media, where he takes questions from the media inside the Oval Office, or before he gets on a helicopter. He stops and takes questions, and he's very direct in his style, as are the spokesperson from Chinese government agencies. Recently, their Commerce Ministry spokesperson has also taken a very tough line when asked questions about U.S.-China trade. But hopefully it's all posturing, and eventually the two sides will begin negotiations and reach some kind of deal. Keeping in mind that they did in January of 2020, they reached what's called the Phase 1 trade agreement. So we have that precedent, and that Phase 1 trade agreement followed on what really had become a trade war that began in 2018 with President Trump raising tariffs on certain Chinese products. So the precedent is there for tough talk followed by negotiations, and we'll see if that's going to hold true for the second Trump administration.
Ross Feingold, pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining the program. We now move on. Ahead of the meeting on Saturday, President Donald Trump once again refused to rule out military action against Iran. The US president stated that Israel would lead strikes on Iran if nuclear talks were to fall apart. This comes ahead of expected US-Iran talks, which Trump called direct, but while Tehran insists they'll be indirect. Trump reiterated his threat of military action if Iran refuses to halt its nuclear program, stressing that Iran cannot be allowed to possess nuclear weapons. He emphasized that if talks fail, military force could follow. Iran, opposing Trump's demands, has agreed to indirect talks in Oman, with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi insisting that no military action should be part of the deal. Trump, who initially withdrew the US from the 2015 nuclear deal in his first term, warned Iran would face great danger if negotiations fail. He also stated that Israel would lead any potential military strike against Iran if it didn't abandon its nuclear weapons program.
But with Iran, if it requires military, we're going to have military. Israel will obviously be very much involved in that. He'll be the leader of that. But nobody leads us. We do what we want to do.
Ahead of talks with Iran, the US imposed new sanctions on 5 Iran-based entities and 1 individual for supporting Iran's nuclear program, aiming to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. These measures target entities involved in the development and procurement of materials for Iran's nuclear activities. Meanwhile, China has previously urged the US to show sincerity in its approach to nuclear talks, advocating for diplomatic efforts to address concerns while ensuring a balanced and constructive agreement with Iran. We are joined by Raymond Vickery, former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce, located in Washington, to discuss this further. Thank you very much, Raymond. It's a pleasure having you on the program. Donald Trump has used aggressive language to say that likely, threatening with strikes that he said would be led by Israel. Is this a way to go about negotiating a potential nuclear deal with Tehran and the Ayatollah Khamenei?
Well, Thanks very much for having me. Of course, it's not the way to go about it, but it is vintage Trump to bluster and threat and walk away if necessary in order to reach what he considers a deal. And his deals are in the mode of a real estate deal in New York. That's his background, and indeed the chief negotiator, Mr. Witkoff, is a fellow real estate developer in New York. What has happened, of course, is a difficult situation presented by walking away from the 2015 agreement, the joint agreement of the parties, and then resorting to bluster in order to come up with some solution. Vintage Trump again to create a problem and then try to say that you've solved the problem that you've created. I think it's a very difficult situation because Trump has painted himself into a negotiating corner, if you will, by saying that he will not go back to the 2015 approach at all, which is sort of an institutional multilateral approach involving Europe, involving other parties, and go for this grand deal in which he says that Tehran has to give up not only the development of a nuclear weapon, but its entire nuclear program, that it has to withdraw from any kind of support in the Middle East for the Houthis or anyone else. And that it will basically leave itself open on the missile end of it. In other words, a complete capitulation. On the Iran side, it's really a similar kind of a situation in which the Ayatollah hasn't backed off at all from being the great Satan, and saying that threats can't be used and they'll defend itself. I think the best hope is that talks are better than war, and we can kick the can down the road without hostilities breaking out, so that saner heads will prevail somewhere down the road.
Raymond, these threats from Donald Trump are not new, but what is new is that he is saying that Israel will lead these strikes if talks were to fall apart. What do you make of Trump's statement there, directly referencing that Tel Aviv will conduct these strikes if Iran doesn't adhere to these treaty plans that the US has in store for it?
Well, to some degree, it's an attempt to demonstrate that Trump has a hold over Netanyahu, that he determines what Netanyahu is allowed to do. This announcement came, after all, during a meeting at the White House in the Oval Office. Also, there is the aspect of domestic politics here. In the United States, people don't want to see the United States being involved, American service people being killed. And this is a way to kind of split that baby, if you will, for domestic purposes. So I think that, yes, it's a delineation which has both the domestic political aspect to it, as well as international relations between Israel and the United States. But to some degree, it's a distinction without a difference. If you get a major war going with Iran, the U.S. is sure to be drawn into it. And so I don't think that part of it is particularly significant. What is significant is that at least Trump wants to not have the United States involved in hostilities and has shown a willingness to resume talks. But as I said earlier, I think that the sides are so far apart that the most likely outcome is kicking the can down the road. And as Winston Churchill said at one point, jaw jaw is better than war war. And so that's good. And at some point, one hopes that the waging of peace, like the waging of war, will win out, and you won't have the open hostilities. But it's not going
Yes.
to be an easy process. It's not going to be an immediate process.
Raymond Vickery, thank you very much for joining us. We now move over to Europe, where US and Russian delegations met in Istanbul today for talks on restoring the functioning of their embassies, which drastically scaled back staffing following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The talks, the second of their kind, come after President Donald Trump reached out to Russia following the start of his second term and offered better ties if it wound down fighting in Ukraine. According to reports, the meeting lasted close to 6 hours. The talks were led by Russia's new ambassador to Washington, Alexander Darchev, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Senata Kolta, Russia's foreign ministry said. US State Department spokeswoman Tammy Bruce had previously said that the two sides will try to make progress on further stabilizing the operations of their bilateral missions. She also had said that Ukraine is absolutely not on the agenda for the talks. Moreover, Russia's US envoy Alexander Darchev said on Wednesday that the talks would focus on getting rid of the toxic legacy that the previous US administration set strict limits on the activities of Russian diplomatic missions. Since Trump's return to the White House, Russian and US officials have been engaged in several tracks of talks, ranging from negotiations over a Ukraine ceasefire and restoring economic ties to technical issues like those on the agenda on Thursday. Moscow also wants the United States to return diplomatic property it claims has been seized, including 2 summer houses used by embassy officials. We are now joined by Professor Alexei Haran, Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Kyiv-Moldya, located in Kyiv, Ukraine. Thank you very much, Professor Haran, for joining us on the programme. These talks come, obviously, they are not specifically about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They have been very adamant about that fact, but it does come amidst a warming of US and Russian relations. What do you make of Moscow and Washington becoming more closer and now not having discussions even about the Ukraine conflict anymore? These two countries now seem to want to get closer diplomatically, Professor Aran.
Well, they're saying that it's about technical issues, how to operate the missions. But frankly speaking, look, it's happening while Ukraine is bombarded, The bombardment from Russia increased. By the way, now there is air alarm in Kyiv, and it lasts for 1 hour already. So, Trump suggested that, okay, let's have full ceasefire. Russia rejected. Instead, they are increasing the bombardments of Ukraine. So Trump was saying on several occasions that he was going, to push both sides for negotiations. Okay, he pushed Ukraine in a very undiplomatic way, I would say. But I don't see, nobody sees that. Are there any concessions from Russia? What Russia is doing in order to show that they are going, to reach the negotiations. So for me, it looks like, and for Ukrainians, it looks like, well, Trump now is helping Putin, to come back to international legitimacy, to be an equal partner with the United States. So Putin is gaining, is receiving what Putin wants. Okay, but there's no any symbol, any sign that Russia is going to have negotiations. So basically, Trump promised to push Russia for that, but we don't see this. What's going on?
Professor Alexei Haran, thank you very much for joining us. Unfortunately, we are very short on time, and so we have to move on. 26/11 Mumbai terror attack accused Tahawar Rana has been successfully extradited to India from the United States. The National Investigation Agency confirmed today. Following his arrival, security has been heightened in Delhi, with Patiala House, courts, premises cleared of media and private persons. Rana is likely to be lodged in Thar jail, where the Delhi court has received the trial records from Mumbai, setting the stage for proceedings. Meanwhile, Pakistan has distanced itself from Rana, claiming he is a Canadian citizen and has not renewed his Pakistani documents for over 2 decades. We are joined by John Rossimondo, geopolitical analyst located in Washington, D.C., USA, to discuss this further. This was, John, thank you very much for joining us. This was a key thing that Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and Donald Trump, President of the United States, discussed in their press conference. This extradition means a lot to the people of India since the 2008 terror attacks. What does it say for US-India relations for the extradition of this man? If you could unmute John, that would be great. I believe that you're muted, unfortunately. We seem to have some technical issues, unfortunately. We will now move on. I'm really sorry, we did face some technical issues there with John Rossimondo, but that is all we have time for, unfortunately. And we will continue to bring you more news updates from across the world. Thank you.